July 16, 1793. Place des Terreaux, Lyon. A former silk merchant named Joseph Chalier climbed onto a wooden platform to be executed by a machine the city had never used before. He did not know the blade was chipped. He did not know the crowd pressing against the frame had already knocked the mechanism out of alignment. The blade dropped. It failed to cut. It dropped again. Still nothing. On the third drop, Chalier was only wounded, and the executioner finished the job by hand, with a knife, cutting through what the machine was built specifically to make unnecessary. This is the story of how one damaged blade in a provincial French square exposed a design flaw hidden inside thousands of executions, forced a state built on the promise of painless justice to confront a problem it believed it had already solved, and opened a question about death by machine that outlived the French Revolution, outlived the guillotine itself, and remains unresolved. Paris, October 1789. A physician and member of the National Assembly named Joseph Ignace Guillotine stood before his colleagues with a proposal that, for its time, sounded almost egalitarian. Under the existing system, only the nobility received the clean death, a sword to the neck from a skilled headsman, over quickly if the swordsman was good at his job. Commoners were hanged, and in the worst cases broken on the wheel or drawn and quartered, methods designed to prolong suffering rather than end it. Breaking on the wheel in particular could stretch across hours. The condemned was tied to a cartwheel, while an executioner shattered each limb bone by bone with an iron bar. And death sometimes came only after the body was left exposed on the wheel for public display, occasionally for days. Against that backdrop, a machine that beheads painlessly, Guillotine's own phrase in his written proposal, looked less like a curiosity and more like a mercy. His proposal was simple on its face. One method of execution for everyone, regardless of class, and that method should be the fastest and least painful one available. His written submission ran to 6 specific articles: identical punishment regardless of rank, death always carried out by decapitation via machine, no confiscation of the condemned's property, and no legal punishment extended to the family. Guillotine personally opposed capital punishment altogether, but if France was going to keep executing people, he wanted it done without unnecessary cruelty, and he believed a fast, guaranteed death would also reduce the size of the crowds that gathered to watch. Guillotine did not design the machine himself. That task fell to a surgeon named Antoine Louis, secretary of the Académie de Chirurgie, working alongside a German harpsichord maker named Tobias Schmidt, who handled the construction. Together, they built a weighted, angled blade that would fall through 2 grooved wooden uprights under gravity alone. None of this was new. Scotland's so-called maiden had been dropping a weighted blade since the 1560s. The Halifax gibbet in Yorkshire had been beheading condemned thieves with a similar falling blade mechanism since the medieval period. France was not inventing decapitation by machine. It was standardizing it and attaching a moral argument to that standardization. This device removes human error and therefore removes unnecessary suffering. In Paris, in early 1792, the National Assembly authorized construction of the first machine before it technically existed as a finished design, and a carpenter named Guillotine was paid 5,500 francs to build it. It was initially nicknamed the Louisette, or Louison, after Dr. Louis. The name that eventually stuck, Guillotine, was at this point still an insult. Parisians had already begun using Guillotine's own surname derisively for the device, and satirical songs mocking him for it were circulating before the machine had killed a single person. The doctor who wanted to reduce suffering was about to have his own name turned into a punchline and then into a permanent synonym for the terror. This looked, at the time, like a small and almost bureaucratic embarrassment. It was not. Before the guillotine ever touched a living person, it had already failed once in testing exactly where a mechanical flaw would be expected to surface first. The man overseeing that test was not a random appointee. Charles-Henri Sanson belonged to a family that had held the office of Paris's chief executioner for 4 generations, passing the role from father to son, the way another family might pass down a farm or a title. Executing people was the Sansons' inherited trade, which made Charles-Henri, by 1792, one of the few people in France with the practical experience to judge whether a new killing machine actually worked. In April of that year, Sanson and 2 of his brothers took the finished machine to the prison at Bicêtre to test it on 3 corpses. The first 2 decapitations, carried out with an oblique, angled blade, worked cleanly. The third test used an alternative blade shaped like a crescent, closer to a straight axe edge, and it failed to cut all the way through. According to the Sanson family's own written account of the event, a straight or crescent-shaped blade could not guarantee a clean cut on every neck. An angled blade sliced more like a sword, while a straight edge crushed more like an axe. The near failure on that third corpse settled the argument. The crescent design was scrapped, and the oblique blade was kept. A popular and almost certainly apocryphal story, one that entered circulation decades later through a Dumas novel, holds that King Louis XVI personally examined the plans beforehand and suggested the blade be angled rather than curved, since a crescent shape certainly could not cut every neck shape. True or not, the story endures because of how closely it foreshadows what came next. A design flaw caught and corrected in a controlled test on a body that could not object, weeks before the machine was used in public, on a body that could. On April 25, 1792, a highwayman named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier became the first person publicly executed by the corrected, oblique-bladed machine. The crowd, anticipating spectacle, was reportedly underwhelmed by how quick and undramatic the execution was. That reaction was, in effect, the entire point of the design. A killing machine efficient enough to give the audience almost nothing to watch. The blade problem had surfaced once, quietly, on a body that could not react. Within a year, it would resurface on one that could, in front of thousands of witnesses. The first person to test that assumption on the largest possible stage was the King of France himself. On January 21st, 1793, 4 days after being convicted of treason by the National Convention, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine on the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Under the new system, the King of France was meant to die exactly the way a highwayman did. That equivalence was the entire philosophical basis for the machine, the reason Guillotine had proposed it in the first place. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, the blade did not fully sever the king's neck on the first drop, reportedly because of the thickness of his neck, and a second pass was needed to finish what was supposed to be a single, instant stroke. An assistant lifted the severed head for the crowd, and according to contemporary accounts, spectators surged forward to dip handkerchiefs and slips of paper in the king's blood. If the machine could fail on the single most closely watched execution in the country, with a national audience and every incentive to get it right, it could fail anywhere, with far less scrutiny and far less record-keeping. 6 months later, in a city that had never used the device before, the machine failed in a way that could not be dismissed as a mechanical fluke. On July 16, 1793, in Lyon, Joseph Chalier became the first person that city had ever sent to the guillotine. The device had only just been erected in the Place des Terreaux for his case, and neither the machine nor the executioner had any prior execution to draw on. His execution was not gruesome, only because the executioner was inexperienced. It was gruesome because the machine itself had been damaged before he ever used it. Records from the investigation that followed describe a chipped blade and a crowd packed so tightly around the scaffold that people leaning on the frame had thrown the mechanism out of alignment. When the blade dropped, it did not strike at the correct angle. Some accounts describe 2 failed drops. The most detailed sources describe 3 or 4. Chalier reportedly grimaced at the crowd between drops, still conscious, before the executioner switched to a hand blade and finished the decapitation himself. The entire justification for building this machine had been to remove the axe, the sword, and the multiple strike beheading from French justice. In Lyon, in 1793, the humane alternative to the axe needed a knife to finish the job. The very next day, a different kind of failure surfaced in Paris, one that struck at the moral premise of the machine rather than its mechanics. On July 17, 1793, a young woman named Charlotte Corday was guillotined in the capital for assassinating the radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat. Moments after her head fell into the basket, a carpenter named Legros, who had been hired to make repairs to the guillotine, lifted her severed head from the basket and slapped it across the cheek. Multiple eyewitnesses reported that Corday's face visibly flushed and registered what they described as an expression of unmistakable, indignant offense. The Revolutionary Tribunal was disturbed enough by the incident that Legros was imprisoned for it. Not for cruelty toward a corpse, but because the act felt, to those watching, uncomfortably close to striking someone still capable of feeling it. The incident undermined public confidence in the machine directly. A device engineered specifically to guarantee an instant, unfelt death had just produced a scene that convinced a room full of witnesses of the opposite. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner who had helped correct the blade design a year earlier, was reportedly angered by reports that Legros belonged to his own staff, insisting in his own later account that the man was only a carpenter hired for repairs, not part of the execution team. Even the professionals who operated the guillotine wanted no association with what that slap implied about what their machine actually did to the people it killed. Months later, in Lyon, that December, a judicial commission interviewed the executioner, a man named Jean Ripet, about what had gone wrong. He told the commission he had not noticed the blade was chipped and had not realized the crowd had knocked the frame out of alignment. He was released without punishment. At that point, France had no national inspection standard for guillotine blades, no maintenance schedule, no calibration protocol, nothing resembling an audit. Every guillotine in the country was, in practice, a locally built and locally maintained device, kept in working order to whatever standard the town carpenter and local executioner happened to apply on a given morning. Ripet did not stay clear of the machine for long. He and his assistant were arrested again the following spring and executed in April 1794. Not over the Chalier incident specifically, but caught up in the same revolutionary violence the device had been built to administer. The machine that failed under his hand in July claimed him less than a year later on the same Lyon scaffold. He and his assistant were the last 2 people ever guillotined in that city. That accountability gap became a national liability quickly, because by late 1793, France was no longer executing people occasionally. It was executing them by the thousands. Historians estimate that roughly 17,000 people were officially guillotined nationwide during the Reign of Terror, a rate that at points reached dozens of executions in a single Paris session. The executioner families of Paris, the Sansons most prominently, effectively functioned as state contractors, responsible for keeping the blade sharp, the frame true, and the weight correctly calibrated for a body they had never examined beforehand. To meet demand, guillotines were manufactured and shipped to towns across the country, each one built by a local carpenter with no shared national blueprint beyond a rough copy of the original design, meaning the same maintenance and calibration gaps that failed Chalier in Lyon existed, to varying degrees, in every department that owned one of these machines. Once a country is executing dozens of people a day, a chipped or misset blade no longer produces a single botched execution. It produces a pattern, A state that has publicly justified its method of killing on the grounds of mercy cannot sustain a visible pattern of half-conscious, multi-drop decapitations. Blade specifications, drop height requirements, and basic maintenance checks slowly and unevenly hardened into something closer to formal procedure, not because of one sweeping law, but because the alternative was producing too many cases like Chalier's in public. In front of crowds, the state needed to keep believing in its own mercy. The irony did not spare the machine's own namesake. Late in the terror, a letter to a condemned aristocrat's family was intercepted and traced back to Dr. Guillotine, and he was imprisoned for refusing to disclose the family's whereabouts to the authorities. He came within weeks of execution by the device that carried his name and was released only after Robespierre's own fall from power in July 1794 ended the terror's momentum. This is a recurring pattern on this channel, a small, overlooked detail carrying a cost far larger than anyone involved could have predicted. The guillotine, from its blade specification down to the man it was named after, is one of the clearest examples on record. The question of whether the machine delivered the instant, unfelt death it promised did not disappear once the terror ended. It resurfaced in print. In November 1795, a letter published in Paris in the official government newspaper The Moniteur claimed that guillotine victims remained alive and aware for several minutes after decapitation. There was no rigorous study behind the claim, no controlled observation, only an assertion in print. But it landed on a public already primed to believe it, by Corday's slapped and flushed face and by Chalier's grimace between drops. Guillotine, according to people who knew him, was shocked by the letter and spent the rest of his life troubled by the possibility that the humane method he had championed was not humane at all. He had already lived through his own encounter with the machine's other cost, a wrongful imprisonment during the terror that nearly ended with his name attached to the device in the most literal sense. Now the government's own press was suggesting that even the executions carried out exactly as designed might not be as painless as he had promised the Assembly in 1789. The claim placed the French state in an uncomfortable position. It had spent 3 years insisting the guillotine's entire value lay in a guaranteed instant death, and its own official press was now printing the opposite, supported by nothing more than secondhand testimony on either side. A generation later, the guillotine remained France's sole legal method of execution, its basic design largely unchanged since Antoine Louise's original drawings. By this point, the engineering had genuinely improved. Maintenance checks existed in most jurisdictions. Blades were replaced on something closer to a schedule instead of being left to chip indefinitely. And the device was still judged safe and humane based on the same core assumption made in that Bicêtre courtyard in 1792, that a sufficiently weighted, sufficiently sharp blade falling from a sufficient height could not fail to kill instantly and could not leave anyone conscious long enough to register what was happening. Nobody had actually proven that second half of the assumption, not with Corday's slap, not with the Moniteur letter. There was no way to ask the person being executed whether it hurt, or whether they remained aware, even briefly, after the blade fell. Executioner posts had by this point settled into something close to a formal civil service role, complete with government-issued equipment and standardized blade replacement. A level of bureaucratic order the Chalier execution never had, and that order alone was treated as sufficient proof the earlier problem was solved. For over a century, the entire moral case for the machine rested on something nobody could actually measure. In Paris, in 1905, the question finally received a direct, deliberate scientific test, the first anyone had attempted, more than a century after Corday's face reportedly flushed under a slap. A French physician named Dr. Gabriel Bourrieux was present at the execution of a convicted murderer named Henri Longueuil. and had arranged in advance to examine the severed head immediately after the blade fell, rather than simply witness the execution. He called out the man's name, according to Bourrieu's own written account. Published afterward as part of a forensic medicine report, Languille's eyelids opened and his eyes appeared to focus on the doctor, twice, on two separate calls, before the face finally went still for good. One physician's account, however carefully documented, does not constitute proof on its own, but it is exactly the kind of detail that turns a supposedly settled engineering question back into an open question. The same open question the state had been quietly living with since a printed letter in 1795 and a slap in 1793. The instinct to fix the reliability problem eventually traveled further than anyone in 1792 could have anticipated. In October 1936, Adolf Hitler ordered that the guillotine, known in Germany as the Fallbeil or falling axe, replaced the hand axe as the official method of civil execution across the country, and had 20 of the machines built and distributed to prisons in Germany and Austria. The German version was shorter than the French model, built from metal rather than wood, and fitted with a heavier blade specifically designed to eliminate the failure modes that had plagued the original French machine. The chipping, the misalignment, the multi-drop failures. It worked. Nazi executioners could reportedly process a prisoner roughly every 3 minutes when required. Between 1933 and 1945, an estimated 16,500 people were executed by Fallbeil under the regime, a number that rivals or exceeds most estimates of the guillotine's toll during the entire French Revolution. The device that began as an Enlightenment answer to unnecessary cruelty had, a century and a half later, been engineered into something reliable enough to function as an assembly line for a genocidal state. Fixing the small mechanical problem had not made the machine safer for humanity. It had made it more efficient at whatever the state pointed it at. While that industrial version operated in Germany, the French original was still failing in public in a completely different way. On the morning of June 17, 1939, a convicted serial killer named Eugène Weidmann was led to a guillotine set up outside the Saint-Pierre prison in Versailles. Several hundred spectators had gathered, some since midnight for a better view, and by the time the blade fell, the crowd was, by newspaper accounts, jostling, whistling, cheering, and in some cases dabbing the victim's blood with handkerchiefs as souvenirs. Among the spectators, by his own later account, was a 17-year-old British tourist named Christopher Lee, decades before he became a well-known actor. The disorder delayed the execution long enough for clear photographs and even a short film to be shot in daylight. The crowd's behavior, collecting blood as a keepsake, echoed the same reaction recorded at Louis XVI's execution and at Corday's a century and a half earlier. Evidence that whatever the machine's engineering had fixed, it had never touched the public's appetite for the spectacle itself. The crowd's conduct embarrassed the French government badly enough that President Albert Lebrun banned public executions within days, not the guillotine itself, only the audience. From that morning forward, France's official method of execution took place only behind prison walls, out of public view. A century and a half after Guillotine argued that painless, mechanized execution was a matter of moral progress, the crisis point in 1939 was not the pain, the botched drops, or the unanswered question sitting in a 1995 newspaper letter. It was that the public, watching the machine work exactly as designed, behaved so badly that the state had to hide the entire process to preserve its own dignity. France continued executing people by guillotine behind prison walls for another 38 years. The last person executed by the device was Hamida Djandoubi on September 10, 1977, in Marseille. Capital punishment itself was abolished in France in 1981. The machine built to answer one specific Enlightenment question, whether the state could kill without cruelty, was retired without that question ever being conclusively settled. The question did not disappear with the guillotine. It changed countries and methods. Modern debates over lethal injection in the United States follow almost identical logic to the one Antoine Louis worked with in that Bicêtre courtyard in 1792. A method is adopted because it is assumed to be quick and painless. Botched executions surface that suggest otherwise, and courts are left ruling on something no one can fully verify, namely what the condemned person actually experiences in the interval between the procedure starting and death. In April 2014, Oklahoma attempted to execute a man named Clayton Lockett using a newly adopted 3-drug lethal injection protocol. Witnesses reported he began writhing and mumbling minutes after the drugs were administered. Officials halted the execution, and Lockett died of a heart attack roughly 40 minutes after the process began. A later investigation traced the failure to a collapsed vein and a poorly placed intravenous line, a procedural detail not unlike a chipped blade or a misset frame that undid a method the state had certified as humane. Different machine, different century, the same unresolved gap between what an execution method is supposed to guarantee and what anyone can actually prove. Even the name never fully settled its debt. Guillotine spent the rest of his life associated with a machine he did not build, and, by most accounts, personally regretted watching become a symbol of the terror rather than the humane reform he had argued for. Persistent, if historically disputed, family accounts hold that his descendants were embarrassed enough by the association to petition the government to change the machine's name, and when that failed, to consider changing their own family name instead. Joseph Chalier climbed onto that platform in Lyon believing, or at least having been told, that France's new machine would make his death quick. It took 3 drops of a damaged blade and a knife to finish what the humane execution was supposed to accomplish in an instant, and more than a century later, a doctor watching a completely different man's severed head still could not say for certain whether the machine had kept its promise. The design changed. The paperwork changed. The blade grew heavier and more reliable, and that reliability was put to far darker use than anyone in 1792 intended. The question a chipped blade in Lyon raised in July of 1793 is still, in a different form, unanswered. For more cases where one overlooked detail exposes something much larger, subscribe, and leave a comment with the historical execution or case worth covering next.